Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
You walk into room 4, and your 9-month-old patient is sitting on the exam table.
Right.
And she reaches for a brightly colored toy, but she only uses her right hand.
Which, to a parent probably looks completely innocent, like she's just developing a preference early on.
Exactly. But to a pediatric neuro nurse, it is a glaring red flag siren that something is wrong deep inside the developing brain. So, welcome to the deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Today, we are taking a massive stack of clinical protocols, anatomical data, and pediatric nursing care standards, and we're putting it all together. If you're prepping for a major nursing exam, consider this your ultimate one-on-one tutoring session.
Yeah, because this isn't a dry lecture. By understanding the baseline of how a child's nervous system is wired, the expected changes suddenly make perfect sense.
Right. Our mission today is to master Chapter 20 from Davis Advantage for Maternal Child Nursing Care, focusing on the what and the why. And joining us is our resident expert, the calm voice of clinical reasoning, to walk us through this.
Happy to be here. Because when you understand those underlying mechanisms, you can instantly recognize the complications, prioritize your care, and ultimately save a child's life.
So let's start with the physical machine itself, the foundation. Before we can spot an anomaly like that early-handedness, we have to understand the normal architecture.
Exactly. The nervous system is essentially split into two major networks. You have the central nervous system, or CNS, which is the brain and the spinal cord.
The command center, basically.
Right, the command center. And then you have the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, which includes your cranial and spinal nerves branching out.
And the foundational building block running through both of those systems is the neuron.
Yes. And to understand how clinical symptoms manifest, you really have to visualize the directional flow of information here. Neurons have dendrites bringing information in, and axons taking the commands away.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because clinical protocols always make a massive distinction between white matter and gray matter.
They do, yeah.
So if we look at the cellular level, is white matter essentially the body's high-speed fiber optic network? Because those axons are coded in myelin, while the gray matter is the actual computer processor making the decisions.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. The white matter is that high-speed transit infrastructure.
Okay.
And the gray matter, which is packed with neuronal cell bodies, does the heavy processing, like the basal ganglia for movement or the hypothalamus for homeostasis.
And the thalamus for sensory processing, right?
Exactly. What's fascinating here is how sensory changes from cerebral damage require nurses to leverage adaptive technologies.
Oh, like what kind of technologies?
Well, like tablet devices to provide alternative sensory input when a child has diminished vision or hearing. You're literally bridging the gap.
Because neuroconditions directly impact growth and development. A child with impaired physical mobility is at a much greater risk for limited intellectual development.
Yeah. Intellect and mobility are a continuous feedback loop. A healthy infant learns spatial reasoning and cause and effect by physically moving.
Which means nursing interventions have to be super proactive, like using physical therapy and range of motion to prevent contractures.
And you even use activities of daily living, or ADLs, like eating or dressing, to actively practice fine and gross motor skills. That struggle builds the neural pathway.
That makes total sense. But what happens when that foundational anatomy is under acute stress? The very first indicator a nurse will see isn't usually motor function, is it?
No, it's an altered level of consciousness. That is your most sensitive indicator.
And consciousness is basically arousal plus thought content.
Yes. Arousal is driven by the brainstem, and thought content is the cerebral cortex.
And when there's an alteration, the most common cause in the pediatric population is an infection, right?
Absolutely. Infections of the brain or meninges are huge, and clinically we see a spectrum of unconsciousness here.
Like stupor versus coma. Stupor requires vigorous or highly unpleasant stimulation to get a response.
Right, whereas in a coma, the child cannot be aroused even by painful stimuli.
That is terrifying. Which leads us into the mechanics of increased intracranial pressure, or ICP. And this is where the pediatric specific focus really kicks in.
It really does. The pressure dynamics inside a baby's skull operate under a very different set of rules compared to adults.
So an infant's skull is essentially like an expandable suitcase for a short time, whereas an older child's skull is a locked safe, meaning pressure builds up much faster.
I completely validate that analogy. Infants can compensate briefly because their fontanelles bulge and cranial sutures spread.
But doesn't that hide the real danger? Like, you might not see a drop in consciousness until they run out of space.
Yes, and that's why an infant crashing from increased ICP happens so violently fast. You have to differentiate early signs from late signs.
Early signs being things like a headache, emesis, and that bulging fontanelle.
Right. And late signs are a severe decrease in the level of consciousness. This is why we rely on the Pediatric Glasgow Coma Scale, the GCS.
Because you can't exactly ask a 6-month-old what year it is.
Exactly. You assess 3 specific components: eye-opening, motor response, and auditory or visual interaction.
And getting a baseline GCS assessment immediately is vital.
Critically vital. You have to know where they started to catch any rapid, life-threatening deterioration.
Because that increased pressure doesn't just squash tissue, it causes the brain's electrical circuitry to misfire.
Which triggers seizures, electrical storms.
And neonates have specific vulnerabilities there, like intrapartum anoxia, maternal teratogens, or hypoglycemia.
Yes. And for school-age kids living with epilepsy, school nurses must have an individualized seizure action plan in place.
Because these electrical storms are often triggered by severe inflammatory conditions, meningitis being a primary culprit.
Right. You have septic meningitis, which is bacterial like strep pneumonia or Neisseria.
And aseptic meningitis, which is viral and peaks in the fall and winter.
Exactly. And if that inflammation moves into the actual brain tissue, you're dealing with encephalitis.
The nursing care for that is incredibly rigid, right? Seizure precautions, monitoring fluids for SIADH.
And positioning. You have to keep their head elevated in midline to avoid compressing the neck veins, which helps drain the pressure.
Ah, okay. Then we have inflammatory conditions of the peripheral nerves, like Guillain-Barré syndrome, or GBS, a painful neuralgia requiring opioids, ROMs, splints, and preventing boredom.
Yes, preventing boredom is a huge, real clinical priority for paralyzed kids. But the pain management is tricky.
So what does this all mean? Wait, if the neuritis in GBS is so incredibly painful, why do the sources say children underreport their pain? Wouldn't they be crying out?
You would naturally assume so. But kids employ magical thinking. They expect the nurse to just know they are hurting.
But so they think you're, like, omniscient.
Exactly. If you wait for a pediatric patient with GBS to hit their call light, you've already failed them. Proactive scheduled pain management is crucial.
Wow, that's a massive clinical pearl. Another condition is juvenile myasthenia gravis.
Yes, which requires acetylcholinesterase inhibitors like neostigmine or pyridostigmine.
And timing is everything with those meds.
A vital safety priority. The medication must be timed, so peak action occurs exactly during mealtime.
So if you don't synchronize it, the child physically lacks the muscular coordination to swallow safely, creating a massive aspiration risk.
Precisely. Now let's move from acquired infections to developmental conditions that originate early in fetal development.
Like spina bifida, which is a neural tube defect where it fails to close at 18 to 28 days gestation.
And the risk factors are maternal hyperthermia, poor nutrition, diabetes, and certain seizure meds.
The most severe form is a myelomeningocele. That's where the meninges and spinal cord elements actually protrude outward.
Yes, which permanently impacts bowel and bladder function. And there's a critical component here regarding head circumference for post-op hydrocephalus.
What are the exact steps for that measurement?
You use a flexible, non-stretchable tape, place it over the occiput and supraorbital ridges, and if it's abnormal, you remeasure immediately.
Good to know. And there's another critical box about latex allergies for these kids.
Yes. Children with spina bifida are highly prone to latex allergies due to repeated early exposure from constant surgeries and catheterizations. Nurses must provide a latex-free environment.
Okay, next in the developmental category is cerebral palsy, or CP, which is non-progressive. Risk factors include prenatal asphyxia, preemies under 32 weeks, and postnatal meningitis.
And maternal infections like CMV. To diagnose CP, we look for persistent primitive reflexes, like the Moro reflex past 6 to 12 months.
Or early hand preference before 6 months. Which brings us back to our Amy Moore case study, a 9-month-old showing early right-handedness. That is a giant red flag, right?
It absolutely is, and the type of CP depends on the brain region damaged. Spastic is rigidity, ataxic is poor depth perception, and athetoid or dyskinetic is writhing and drooling.
So how do nurses manage this day-to-day?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, nurses must use assistive devices like large-handled brushes and allow frequent rest periods because those muscle spasms are exhausting.
That makes a lot of sense. So moving on to when a perfectly developed nervous system is devastated by a sudden external force, traumatic brain injury or TBI.
It remains a leading cause of child death from motor vehicle crashes, falls, and always evaluate for this abuse.
Always. And injuries can be direct or indirect, like rotational shearing. But the immediate clinical priority is always the airway, using a bag valve mask.
Always secure the airway. Then assess for basal skull fracture signs. CSF lead from the ears or nose, hemotympanum, battle sign, or raccoon eyes.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If a child has a suspected basal skull fracture, the text gives a strict safety warning. We absolutely cannot use a nasogastric tube, right? Because it could literally enter the brain through the fracture.
I completely affirm that. It is a catastrophic complication. You must use an orogastric tube instead to safely bypass the skull base.
Wow, and these same traumatic forces also cause spinal cord injuries, or SCI, and seizure.
Right. Spinal cord injury without radiographic abnormality.
Yeah.
C-spine immobilization is the absolute priority.
And the text outlines a terrifying crisis for long-term SCI patients. Autonomic dysreflexia.
Yes, a massive sympathetic stress syndrome overload. It's a medical emergency causing extreme hypertension, bradycardia, severe headache, and flushing.
Because a stimulus below the injury, like a distended bladder, gets blocked and triggers this massive reflex loop.
Exactly. And the nursing intervention is to instantly find and remove that trigger before they have a stroke.
Okay, finally, scaling down from acute trauma to everyday sensory conditions, like headaches.
Right, primary headaches from sleep or stress versus secondary from trauma or tumors. Nursing teaching here is simple. Keep a headache record to track triggers.
And we assess for eye disorders like refractive errors, strabismus, and amblyopia. But since children don't always know what normal vision is, how often do they actually complain about these disorders?
This raises an important question. Children rarely complain of vision difficulty unless there is a physical injury.
So they just think the blurry world is normal.
Exactly. It relies entirely on the nurse and parents to notice abrupt changes, like sudden clumsiness or squinting.
The exact same principle applies to language and hearing. Catching deficits in receptive or expressive language early is paramount.
It truly is. Looking at all these developmental challenges, I want to leave you with one final thought. Consider the profound reality of neuroplasticity.
Oh, that's the ultimate silver lining in pediatric neurology.
It really is. While conditions like CP or a TBI cause permanent damage, the developing brain can rewire itself through the exact nursing interventions we discussed today.
Like ROM and targeted play.
Yes. You aren't just managing symptoms. You are physically providing the inputs required to sculpt and rewire that child's brain.
What a powerful lens to view this through. Well, that covers Chapter 20. On behalf of the Last Minute Lecture team, thank you so much for joining us for this review. You've got this.